Noted, I'm the former mayor of San Jose, and before I get into talking about the San Jose history and the California issues and the prospects for becoming more sustainable on an economic basis, I need to do a few disclosures. First, I'm a Democrat. I'm a Kennedy Democrat, and that's John, not Teddy. And some of you here are old enough to remember the difference, and there is a difference. I am a CalPERS pensioner. I get a check every month from CalPERS based on my 14 years of service in office in San Jose. I want to make sure I get every penny that I've earned. And I want to make sure that every other CalPERS pensioner gets every penny that they've earned, and all the CalSTRS pensioners get every penny that they've earned. And that's why I'm involved in the pension reform efforts around California. During the time I was mayor, I went to the ballot 5 times with tax measures. So I'm not opposed to raising taxes. I also went to the ballot 4 times with pension reform measures. Now, one of them made the national news in 2012 because I'm a Democrat mayor in a Democrat city, in a Democrat county, in a Democrat state, a deep blue state at that. And yet, when we went to the voters with our pension reform measure, we got a nearly 70% yes vote. I say nearly 70% because I'm accused of exaggerating if I say 70%, because it was only 69.6%. So nearly 70% yes vote in a heavily Democrat town. And I'll talk a little bit about the circumstances of that to give you some of the background. Currently, I'm an advocate for retirement security. I'm a board member and chairman of the board for an organization called Retirement Security Initiative. We are bipartisan advocates for sustainable pensions around the country. We're involved in probably about a dozen states at this time, including California. My board members and I have been involved in nearly all of the significant pension reform at the state level in the last decade, as well as quite a few at the local level. Now back to San Jose. So why would a Democrat city support pension reform over the objections of the public employee unions who spent hundreds of thousands of dollars to try to stop it? The voters said yes by 70%. Well, why was that? San Jose is the 10th largest city in the country, 3rd largest in California. We have over 1 million people. We have 2 independent pension plans, one for police and fire, one for nearly everybody else, and then a tiny one for elected officials. It's CalPERS plan. Our 2 independent plans had earned in excess of 7.5% since their inception. We never took a pension holiday. We always paid the ARC, which was the actuarial required contribution, now called the ADAC, actuarial determined contribution. We always paid that in full. And yet, we had billions of dollars of unfunded liabilities. Our retirement costs, which is pension plus what they call OPEB, healthcare for retirees, went from about $70 million a year to over $300 million a year. Now, that $300 million is against a spending amount of about $1 billion. So San Jose today pays more than 25% of its general fund dollars to pay for retirement costs. That's a pretty big number. And if you're not at 25% yet, count your blessings, because you're probably headed there. It's all a matter of time. So we took the issue to the voters because we decided that the fight to do pension reform was necessary and the alternative was worse. The alternative was doing nothing and let the city continue to slide into insolvency. During the 10 years leading up to our pension reform ballot measure, we had 10 years of cutting services every year to balance the budget. The year before we did our pension reform, we had a shortfall in our general fund, which is, that's where all the action is, that's where the services are provided. A shortfall in our general fund of $115 million, and our general fund spending was $800 million. And that was the 10th year in a row of shortfalls. So we decided that if we did nothing, we would be insolvent certainly on a service delivery model, we'd be insolvent. During that 10-year period, we went from 7,400 employees to 5,400 employees. There was no department in the city that didn't take a hit. Now, that's true even though the spending was going up, because we were cutting employees to balance the budget. The cost per employee was going up dramatically, which meant we're going to have less of them. Because even though revenues went up in some of those years, the revenues never went up enough to cover the increasing costs of employees. And those costs are driven primarily by skyrocketing retirement costs. And so in 2011, we decided enough is enough. We're going to take on the fight. We set a baseline for the level of services that we thought we should provide to our people. They weren't a very good level, but it was at a level that we were at and said we can't get any worse, although we did. We set that baseline, and then we adopted a fiscal reform plan. The pension reform was only one element of the fiscal reform plan, an important element, but all of our employees also took a 10% pay cut. Every employee, including the mayor, I took a 10% pay cut. Our police officers and our firefighters voted to take a 10% pay cut. 4 of our unions declined to vote for it, and so we imposed, after long, long negotiations, we imposed pay cuts on those 4 unions. So all of our 11 unions, all of our non-union personnel, all of our council members, we all took a 10% pay cut. And then we did pension reform. We went to the ballot with pension reform. The reason we did that because the alternative was worse. The alternative was service delivery, insolvency, and perhaps bankruptcy, and we decided we weren't going to go any further. Now, in that decision, I had 100% support of my one Republican. We only allow one Republican on the city council at a time in San Jose, although there are 3 now, but during my term in office, we only had 1 out of 10. And so I had half of the Democrats, my one Republican, and myself, because I got 1 vote as a member of the city council, and that was a majority to do the things we needed to do. And the Democrats supported it because the alternative was worse. We were crowding out services, we were cutting services in every department. We laid off police officers, we laid off firefighters. Now, when you start laying off police officers, you know you've pretty much reached the end of the road for what you can do with cuts. There's a limit. You can't cut your way out of this problem. And so we decided we had to take it on, and that's what we did. So that's the San Jose story. We talk a little bit about California, CalPERS and CalSTRS. Most of the people in California are in either CalPERS or CalSTRS. There's a couple of dozen counties that have county plans called 37 Act plans. There's a couple of dozen big cities like San Jose that have independent plans. But most people are in CalPERS and CalSTRS. If you look at what's happened in CalPERS and CalSTRS, now CalPERS is the biggest public employee pension plan in the country. CalSTRS is probably the second largest, but it's certainly the largest teacher plan in the country. These are the biggest, the best, the smartest, the most sophisticated at everything. Just read their materials, you'll realize that. But yet, since 1999, CalPERS and CalSTRS have run negative year after year after year, running up a pension debt both in excess of $100 billion. Now that's 17, 18 years of failure, depending upon how you count it. That's a lot of failure. And so running up that pension debt is now driving the costs up because somehow we got to pay down that pension debt. But the fundamental problem is a systemic problem. You can't just blame the CalPERS board or the CalSTRS board. You have to blame the people who made funding decisions who are in the legislature. You have to blame the taxpayers for electing the politicians that negotiated the deals that boosted benefits without paying for them. Because the simple reality is we have underfunded our obligations to our public sector employees since 1999. And now we have these enormous debts in excess of $200 billion between those 2 plans. And the independent plans and the county plans have more on top of that. Enormous debt that needs to be paid because people have earned benefits and they deserve to be paid those benefits. Unfortunately, although you've seen some increase in your costs for your retirement costs here, as is everybody, we're not done yet. The California League of Cities published a study in January of 18. It's posted on their website, a retirement system sustainability study. And they said, rising pension costs will require cities over the next 7 years to nearly double the percentage of their general fund dollars they pay to CalPERS. And that's the optimistic scenario, because that assumes that CalPERS will earn 7% on its investments this year, next year, next year, next year, for 30 years. That's optimistic. Less than a 50-50 probability they can do that. And that's based on their own numbers. So we're continuing to underfund the system, even though costs are going to go up by double. So look forward to future costs on top of the double. So what can you do about it? Well, this is California. CalPERS, CalSTRS, at the local level, much of what needs to be done has to be done at the state level, either by the legislature or by initiative. But I think that in the next few years, people at the local level are going to get the opportunity to do some things about the sustainability of their own pension systems, just as we did in San Jose. Now, San Jose is a little bit different because we have independent plans. We got to go to our voters and let our voters make the decisions. That's harder to do if you're a CalPERS or a CalSTRS agency. But there are things that can be done. And a relatively narrow range of things that can be done and should be done, but it takes a confluence of events to make it possible. And an organization like this, and those of you that are here, need to understand that local leadership is the key. When we look around the country at the dozen or so states where we're working on pension reform and the places where pension reform has been done, local leadership. Now, in some cases that's legislative leaders at the state level, sometimes it's mayors, sometimes it's other people in elected office, but leadership is key. As an organization, we help bring technical expertise, political expertise into places that are trying to do pension reform, but we can't create leadership. That's your job, to figure out the leadership to do it. So leadership from the top of whatever organization it is critical. Maybe that's a city manager, maybe it's a mayor, but somebody has to lead. There's a lot of negotiations, often with unions, more often among the elected officials as to what's going to happen. Because in some states we're negotiating in the middle of negotiations between the governor and the legislature, or the House and the Senate. In some places we're involved with negotiations with the public employee unions. Because in some jurisdictions, the public employee unions can do math. And they understand it is their plan that's in trouble. It is their members who are not going to get paid their full pensions if the plans don't pay. And we've seen that in California already. What people don't understand about CalPERS and CalSTRS, but more so CalPERS, is CalPERS is a gigantic plan, but it's really a couple of thousand plans. And so if Loyalton stops paying its CalPERS costs, Loyalton employees see their pension benefits cut by 50%. So if your agency runs into hard times sometime before you die and doesn't pay its CalPERS costs, CalPERS will cut your pension. They're not going to cut my pension because your city falls on hard times. So these are individual plans within the CalPERS umbrella. And so we've seen 3 or 4 places in California in the last couple of years where the employees took a hit, the retirees took a hit. And that's a bad thing. People should get paid what they've earned, but the public employee unions need to be part of that discussion, part of that equation. And if the California Supreme Court issues a ruling, which we expect by the end of this year in a case called CAL FIRE versus CalPERS, we may get the green light to negotiate more items about pensions than we've ever had at the local level. So you need to be prepared for the opportunity. But you can't wait until the Supreme Court issues a decision, because this takes a very long time. What people didn't understand about San Jose We were an overnight sensation, national news, reported in all the newspapers. We started working on that 6 years before Election Day. In my very first State of the City speech, year number 1, I said the structural budget deficit, an annual ongoing structural budget deficit, is public enemy number 1. That was the very first year I was elected. 6 years later, we finally went to the voters with a ballot measure on pensions. And we did a lot of work in between, because this is not simple, it is not easy, it's difficult. That's why you have to have leadership. You have to get engaged earlier, educating people, so that when you do go to them eventually, they'll be prepared to make good decisions. So what can you do? Well, first, you can do nothing. That's a very popular approach. Many of our leaders in public employee unions in California think that's sufficient, that 17 years of failure at CalPERS and CalSTRS is nothing to worry about. So you can do nothing and hope for the best. Don't worry, be happy. A lot of people do that. That's a huge mistake. You can put more money into the plans. In fact, you will put more money into the plans. You need to put a lot more money in the plans. The question is, where does the money come from? How much more money do you have to put in? But there is no system in the country that works if you don't put the money in. These are all predicated on putting the money in. So you're going to put more money in. The question is how you manage it. So you can cut services. You're all familiar with that. You can raise taxes. Maybe in Kern County you don't ever raise taxes, but in the Bay Area we raise taxes a lot. So cut services, raise taxes. But eventually you reach a point where you decide we can't cut services anymore, we can't raise taxes anymore, or you choose not to for philosophical reasons. And what's the alternative? Pension reform. Look at your retirement benefits and do something about the rising costs. You can negotiate for your employees to pay more. That's a very common thing that has been done in California. And you don't have to wait for the California Supreme Court to tell you you can do that. In many cases, it's an opportunity today to get the employees to pay more. There's still places where employees aren't paying their share. You can reduce pay. Ultimately, all the money comes out of the same pot, whether it's salary or pension or health care. It all comes out of the same pot. And if you can't afford to pay your employees more, you may be in a situation like San Jose where we had to reduce the pay so we could afford to pay for the retirement benefits. Our retirement benefits costs have continued to go up. Even though our employees took a 10% pay cut, we use those savings to help fund the benefits, and that's something you can do. Or you can do pension reform. Now, pension reform, the technical side, the design of the plans, that's easy. I got a couple of people that work with me. Give us an hour, tell us what you want, and we can give you a plan to do that. That's been done in other cities or other states. The technical work is complicated, but it's not hard. The really difficult part is on the political side. And that's true whether it's a red state or a blue state, whether you have strong employee unions or no employee unions. It is still hard because you're affecting the lives of people that work for you. You're affecting the lives of people that are public servants. You're affecting the lives of your taxpayers, and there is no simple or easy answer. You have to kind of work on what's least unfair? Or what will do the least harm? Because there is no solution that's fair to everybody. People have expectations that aren't going to be met. Taxpayers have needs that aren't going to be met. So that's why it's difficult politically. And it doesn't matter whether the governor is a Republican or a Democrat, or the legislature is a Republican or a Democrat. It's hard. It has not been easy anywhere. Arizona was probably the easiest one because the public safety employee unions at the state level decided they were in trouble. They knew they were in trouble, and they engaged in the beginning. And after 105 meetings and negotiating sessions, we had a bill that got passed by the legislature, signed by the governor, put in front of the voters to amend their constitution. And we did that 2 years ago, and we have 2 more going in this fall. That was the easy one. That only took about 4 years. The hard ones take longer. And you'll probably do it more than once. because it's so difficult that you get what you can get, what's politically possible. You do that knowing that you're probably not going to solve the problem completely because it's really, really difficult to solve it in one swoop. Where to start? I suggest you start with broad principles, a community task force, broad engagement to decide what are the principles on which you want your employees to work. How much retirement should they have? Should they have, what percentage of income should they have in their retirement? How many years should they work? Philosophically, what are the principles? You know, do you want to keep a defined benefit plan? Do you want to have a defined contribution plan? Do you want to have something in the middle like a cash balance plan? You get into those details, but first you have to decide, what do you think is fair? Do you think it's fair that people make more in retirement than they do while they're working? Most people think that's unfair. Do you think it's fair to cut people's pension benefits after they've already retired and the city runs out of money? Most people think that's unfair. So there's a lot of unfairness. And probably the least unfair alternative is doing things that affects the expectation of your current employees. Because while doing something that affects new employees is certainly fair, relatively speaking, it also doesn't save you any money. It doesn't do anything about your unfunded liabilities, doesn't do anything about the pension debt, except maybe help you pay for it. And so you come back to having to deal with your current employees, and that's hard. These are good people doing good jobs that you really value, and some of you may value some over others, but nevertheless, it's difficult to do things that affect their expectations. But that's pretty much what you have to do. But if you establish the broad principles and get a broad community engagement, that is the basis on which you then move forward. Having established the principles, say, well, okay, now how do we implement those? What does it take to get to a sustainable pension plan? What is sustainable? And what does it take to get there? And you work your way through that. And in that whole process, you educate your electorate, you educate your people because you try to engage them in a political process. Having the answer is not the answer. Having the answer is just the beginning, because you've got to bring everybody else along. And sometimes your public employee unions will engage, sometimes they'll be helpful, many times not. In California so far, most of the public employee unions have decided to just say no. And that's a hard place to start the conversation, but you can have those conversations and those negotiations. One of the things that was mentioned earlier, your transparency effort and your sustainability efforts. So transparency is an important part of what I call preparing the community for fiscal reforms. Because if the community doesn't understand what you do, the community doesn't understand your problems, the community doesn't trust your budget, if they don't trust your numbers, they're not going to be supportive when you ask them to do something that's difficult. And what's not widely known about San Jose, in that 6 years leading up to our pension reform ballot measure, we did 80, probably more than 80, but round numbers 80, fiscal, transparency, and open government reforms, which laid the groundwork so that when we went to the voters, they trusted us. They believed our numbers. You know, not everybody believed us, but the electorate did. That's why we got a 70% yes vote. So some simple things we did out of the 80. Some of them are pretty complicated. One of the simple things, my favorite thing, is in California, you all know about the Brown Act. You got to give people notice before you do something that affects them. Before your city council approves something, you got to give people notice. 72 hours. So that means on Friday at 5 o'clock, you can publish the agenda for your meeting on Tuesday, and at 2 o'clock on Tuesday, you can vote. Now, that's really not a lot of time for the public, 1, to hear about it, and 2, to get organized, and 3, to take action. And so we decided that in San Jose, we'd like to have fair fights. We're still going to argue about these things. We'd have a fair fight by requiring everything that was going to be done by the council to be published with 10 days notice. So we backed everything up a week. Now, we still had our fights and our political disagreements, but the people who cared, the activists in the neighborhood who weren't insiders at City Hall could now find out about things before we did them to them. And they could get engaged, they could get organized, and they knew what was going on before it happened. That was a huge confidence builder. It also made our staff a little more honest, a little more truthful, because you're going to put this stuff out there and people are actually going to have a chance to read it. And they might even read about it in a newspaper. You all remember newspapers, right? You still have them here. They might read about it in a newspaper, or their neighborhood watch, might be posting this stuff online, but they can get engaged. So that was really important. So that meant that union contracts, for one, that has to get approved by the council, were posted 10 days before the council meeting, not 3 days before the council meeting, which gave people a chance to review them, because the way it worked in San Jose, and I know it works this way in other places, we're negotiating, all in secret. Closed session negotiations with the union contracts, which, by the way, eats up about 75% of the budget typically, all done in secret. And then when we got close to a deal, we'd say, okay, staff, we think maybe we're going to have a deal. Well, let's put it on the council next week. We'll put it on the council and say we're going to vote on a deal. Well, we don't know the deal because we haven't approved the deal finally. It's got to be ratified by the union, blah, blah, blah. So we go into closed session on Tuesday morning, have the final deal points. Council would vote on them in closed session, and then it would be on the public session at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So the public really got an hour or two of notice of what the terms of the deal were. So we decided that our deals would be posted when made. Whatever offer the union might put on the table, whatever offer we might put on the table, would be posted online whenever they were made. So the taxpayers could watch it as we piled money on the table or whatever we did. They could see what was going on and they could get engaged if they wanted to. Again, a confidence building device. And then the other thing we did is something that everybody can do. You don't need authorization from the legislature. It's called full disclosure budgets. Now, most city and county budgets are a lot of gobbledygook. Just people don't understand it, they can't track it, they can't follow it, and it's almost always based on an accrual basis. There's almost nothing you can't hide in an accrual basis budget if you want to. Do not settle for a cash basis budget. Do not settle for a cash basis budget because you can hide so much in a cash basis budget. But you don't have to go to an accrual basis budget. Do a full disclosure budget, which is not only do you talk about the things you are funding, you talk about the things you are not funding. You talk about how much the infrastructure backlog is. You talk about how much the pension debt is. You talk about how much the increase is going to be to cover your pension costs. Talk about how much it would cost every year just to keep the streets in the same condition they're in. And all of that's in the budget documents, in plain language, plain terms that people can understand. And then you work those issues in the community meetings and the budget discussions so that people understand the reason your community center is closed is because we had to put more money into our retirement systems. Now in San Jose, it was an easy sell because we had 4 libraries, brand new libraries built with bond funds that we had fences around and locks on. Why didn't we open those libraries? Because we didn't have the money. We spent it on other things. Spent it on higher priorities, public safety and other higher priorities. In San Jose, we have one of those like once a minute because we're right under the airport in San Jose, so I'm used to that. I'll talk a little bit about the language that you use in discussing this problem as you begin to try to develop a community consensus around what to do. First, it's important to talk about the crowd out. While budgets are difficult to understand, pension stuff is even more complicated for most people. What they do understand is if their library is closed, or the hours at the community center have been cut back, and you can show, well, we had an extra $20 million to spend, but we didn't put it into your library because we had to spend it on retirement costs. They understand that. They get the crowd out. And while people generally don't want to see their taxes raised, and they generally don't want to see service cuts, They generally don't want to do pension reform either, because it's hard. But given the choice of more service cuts, or more taxes, or pension reform, if you're being reasonable, trying to solve a problem, the voters will support it. We proved that in San Jose and other jurisdictions. But it's a reasonable approach to solving a problem. And everybody can understand the problem of underfunded pensions, the debt. They understand it best in terms of the crowd out as your costs go up to cover the debt. Services are being crowded out. I haven't done a detailed look at Bakersfield, but almost all of the cities in the state, except for some of the really wealthy ones, have seen services crowded out. The wealthy ones are lucky they've had enough revenues that they can kind of maintain their services while paying their higher pension and retirement costs. Finally, I want to go back to fairness. Fairness is an important thing. The voters won't support you if they think you're just trying to screw the employees. They won't support you if they think you're just trying to kill the unions. They want to be fair, but they also understand there's a fairness to the taxpayers. They want to be getting services that they paid for. It's fair to do that. Frame it in fairness terms, or in the least unfair category of terms, because people are trying to be reasonable. They generally like their public employees. They generally like the work they do. They generally appreciate the services they get. They'd like to get more of it. But they know if there's a problem, and it's a serious problem, some things that are difficult have to be done. And you can sell your voters on that. They will understand it, but you got to put it in plain terms, and crowd out is the way to go. And then finally, blame. Everybody wants to talk about blame. There's so much blame to go around. You don't really need to point the blame at any one person or one group of people. Blame goes everywhere. In this one, 20 years of blame. There's plenty. But if you got to blame somebody, blame the politicians. Because after all, it was our responsibility to look after the taxpayers. It was our responsibility to fully fund the benefits that we gave to people. It's our responsibility, and we did a crappy job as elected officials. So as taxpayers, it's your responsibility to hold us accountable. So if you want to blame somebody, blame the politicians. But I try not to get engaged in the blame game. There's just so much blame. It doesn't really matter. We have a systemic problem. The legislature hasn't put up enough money. CalPERS hasn't done a good job. CalPERS is helping to underfund with their assumptions. The taxpayers don't want to put more money in. There's plenty of blame. So focus on the politicians. We're used to it, and we deserve it. What the heck? Finally, let me just go back to working the issues. It took us many, many years in San Jose to work these issues. The pension reform we've seen successfully around the country has taken years, sometimes multiple iterations. It's not easy to do, but it can be done. We've seen it quite a few places around the country where people have done substantive pension reform despite difficult times, be it Republicans or Democrats. It can be done. And with that, I'll leave you with that note of optimism. It can be done. You just have to figure out how to do it. And I'm happy to be a little bit of help as I can. And with that, I think we're going to take some questions up to the boss here.